Alright, so we're going to go over the basics of soldering. To start to solder, you're going to need, first of all, the solder. There's a couple of different types of solder that are available on the market, and each are sort of tailored to whatever your specific need is, whether you're doing plumbing soldering, electronic soldering, or whether you're doing some artistic sheet metal, copper work. We'll go over the solder first. You're going to be able to find probably very common still is the 50-50, which is a lead tin solder. This is good for using on drain lines or for for sheet metal work. You do not want to use this on drinking water or any type of something that might come into to contact directly with you. Even for jewelry purposes, obviously you're not going to want to use this. You're going to want to use something a little bit more appropriate. You can also use this for electronics. Now, of course, if you're going to be doing any type of electronic soldering work, you're going to want to buy electronic solder. This stuff is really good because it has a product in it called flux, which we're going to talk about in a bit. You can use this for other purposes. You're not going to use this for soldering plumbing, just because, as you can see, the gauge of the wire is quite thin. Comes in a couple of different gauges of wire. This one here should show as a 0.02 gauge, and this is a little bit thicker, which is what I like to use for my electronics, at 0.032. Both are available at Radio Shack, electronic stores, and of course the other solder that's available, the heavier stuff, is available Home Depot hardware stores. As I said, this is a 50-50. What I really like to use is the Silpure. It's a silver and tin compound. Works really good. It's got a slightly higher melting point, but you don't have to deal with the lead in the joints, and you still end up with a nice even solder joint when you're finished, or sheet metal work, or whatever you're doing. The other type of solder that you're going to find that's very, very common, there's no label on it, but this is 95.5, which is tin and antimony. It has roughly, once again, a slightly higher melting point, but quite common in plumbing applications. So, of course, soldering is going to usually entail copper, pipe, fittings, wire, brass if you're into that. A lot of people don't realize you can solder steel, various types of if you're doing ornamental stuff, you can solder to it. Depends on the application. If you're doing any type of jewelry, I don't have any brass or silver stuff, but I do have some copper wire that we'll use as a demonstration here in a minute. And of course, one of the products that we're going to need, you have to have, and we mentioned it in the electronic solder, is the paste flux or acid flux. There's a couple of different products out there. There's stuff that you can get that's quite aqueous. I don't really like to use it, just because if I smear some on a piece of sheet or on my fitting in the aqueous form, it has a higher acid content and it'll begin to immediately eat the copper pipe, and you can't leave it out for any length of time. You have to solder with it right away, whereas the paste, I can put it on and I can come back an hour from now if I get distracted, and it's not going to eat away at the copper or the fittings, and you can still continue to solder with it. Some other things you're going to need: I use a sand cloth. This is an older piece, but you can hang on to it. It'll last for quite a while. You won't need to replace it. It comes in a big roll. If you don't have such a thing, you can use a low grit, just a typical sandpaper. Here we have a 180 grit sandpaper. I've also been able to use the Brill pads. They work quite well too, but they don't last very long. The idea is with the sandcloth is to rough up the surface, but we'll get into that once we've gone over everything. And then of course you're down to two basic methods of soldering. You can solder with gas, or you can solder with electrical power. I have a Weller model. This is a great little unit here. It has a wet sponge so I can clean my tip if I need to. And and of course a rag. Now, when you're using a rag for soldering, very crucial that you use a cotton-based rag. Don't use a poly-based rag because it'll melt, and you don't want that stuff on your pipe. Now, after you're finished soldering your joint, you're going to have a lot of this excess paste that's going to be sitting on your pipe. It just doesn't look good. So it's always good to give your joint a wipe when it's finished, and you want to do that with a cotton rag. It doesn't matter if it's clean or dirty. That's basically what you need. Maybe a couple of tools. I like using needle nose for my finer ornamental stuff. Of course, you can use a bench, or you can, quite often gloves are always a good investment. So let's get started. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to solder a 1/2 inch 45 onto a piece of pipe. The first thing we're going to want to do, now generally it's a good idea to deburr the inside of the pipe if you're doing plumbing sort of stuff, especially if you're doing a recirculation line for plumbing, if you've got a pump on a line. The idea is you want to have that line run with as much laminar flow or as much smooth flow as possible. And if you have a little lip from cutting the pipe, it'll create little vortices and it'll actually prematurely wear out the copper pipe. So one thing I need here as well, which I forgot to grab, is a wire brush. Now this is a 3/4 inch wire brush, but I've narrowed down the tip so I can use it for 1/2 inch. So you take your fitting, give it a good wipe with your rag. You want to make sure that you've really taken all the oxidized copper off of the inside of the pipe. Manufacturers of fittings and pipe also coat the copper with a light varnish. So the idea is you want to get a lot of that varnish off as well. Mostly on older fittings though, it's just oxidation. So you want to clean that up, and you take your end of your pipe and you give it a wipe. So you want to make it nice and shiny. Once again, if it's going to be pump line, or if you really want to do a good job, burr it out. For the sake of this demonstration, we're not going to bother with that. I'm going to take a small amount of flux. I'm going to put a light coating on the end of the pipe. Not too much. I've seen some guys and they just dope the stuff on like there's no tomorrow. Don't need to worry about that. Put a little on your fitting as well. Put the fitting on. Give it a little turn in there just to make sure that it's in there good and tight. Smears the flux around. Then you're going to want to give it a wipe. Get all that excess flux off, because it's going to drip all over the place when it's done. Now, you're going to prop your fitting, your torch in here somehow so you can solder with it. Now, for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to use the Silphos, or Silpure, pardon me. Silphos is a brazing solder, or a brazing rod, which is a different gamma, which I might do a little thing later. So first thing you want to do is you want to heat it up. Now, because this is 1/2 inch copper, it's really not going to take too terribly long to heat up. Now, if I was to take this torch and I was to stick it on here for a long period of time, what would end up happening was the pipe would get green. You would see it, the flame would actually turn green. Usually once you've reached the green point, you've got enough heat on there, you can put your solder on the joint and finish fixing the fitting to the pipe. If you left it on there for too long, you would actually burn the flux and the solder wouldn't take into the fitting, and if you were using this for pressure purposes, for plumbing purposes, it would leak like a sieve. So we're just going to take this pipe here, and I'm going to prop this up here. Didn't set this up very well here, did I? Okay, so now take this Silpure. Okay. See that flowing in there? Okay. So you don't want to put too much solder into the joint because it's going to end up looking messy. And once you see the solder go from bright and shiny like a chrome type finish to where it slightly goes to a dull finish, then you take your rag and you give it a wipe. If you do this before, what ends up happening is the solder is still in a molten state and you'll smear it all over the pipe and you end up with a sloppy joint. Now that's not too good. Now if you end up with a joint that's you're not too happy with, you can always heat it up. Let it cool. Give it a wipe. Now, I didn't let it go too long there. You see what happens there? It'll actually smear the solder. When you wipe, don't wipe down the pipe, wipe with the joint. So if it does smear and it's still hot, you're keeping it so that it looks fairly neat. And that's a solder joint. That would hold quite a bit of pressure, I would imagine. And another type of soldering that you can do is ornamental. Ornamental soldering I like to do because I do some tin work. I make cups, pots. I've made dollies out of the stuff. Now, granted, it's becoming incredibly expensive, but it's a little bit more tricky when you're dealing with ornamental stuff. And primarily, a lot of that has to do with the fact that if you're using a standard torch head, you can't. It's just too awkward. Not only that, but you're going to get the fitting too hot. You're going to burn carburize the flux, and it's not going to work. So generally, this is not a very good way of doing things, but you can do this. I'm going to give you a little example here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take this steel galvanized nail, and I'm going to solder it to this piece of copper here. And I'll show you a little trick. I'm just going to adjust the camera just a little bit here. So I'm going to have to hold this up a little bit. So, and whether you're doing pipe or whether you're doing ornamental stuff, once again, very important that you keep the fitting clean. You keep all of your stuff clean. So we're just going to take a bit of this sandcloth and we're going to rough up the point that we're going to solder to, get it nice and clean, get all of the oxidation and varnish off of the fitting. We're going to do the same thing to our nail. You're never really going to do this in a real world application. I'm just showing, the purpose of this is just to show you that you don't have to solder just copper or brass. You can solder steel as well. There's just really no commercial or residential applications for it other than just ornamental. So again, I'm going to take a little bit of flux. I'm just going to put a little bit on the tip of this nail. Put a little bit here. I'm going to flop it down like so. Okay, so now if you're going to use a torch, you do not want to put the heat directly on the fitting. The reason is it'll immediately burn the flux. What you need to do is actually heat the underside of the fitting. Yeah, you want to bring the temperature of the fittings and the nail up to the melting point of the solder that you're using. We're going to use a different solder here. Just for poops and giggles, let's use electronic solder. Now this already has the flux in it, but solder for the most part is solder. Now this is really good stuff for using obviously for electronic purposes, but it'll work in this case as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to heat this up. You'll see that the solder starts to burn. It'll get hot, and if you get too hot, it'll start to burn. You don't want that. So you want to get it just to the point where you almost need an extra pair of hands here. Now, one nice thing about this torch is I can turn it on, lock it on. I'm just going to put a little bit off camera here and heat this up. So you can see now that copper and that steel nail have melted nicely. I'm going to wait for it just to set up, go from a shiny to a sort of a dull sheen. Now you can't really see on the camera here, but you'll be able to tell close up when you've reached that point. Mostly you'll be able to tell just by how stiff it is. Once again, you want to make sure you wipe it down. Get that black flux off of it. It just makes it look better. Now if you're doing this for ornamental purposes and you want to clean it up even more, take a Dremel or a wire brush, and all of this spillage that you've got here will actually will just clean off quite nicely. So that's to show you, it doesn't have to be copper to copper. You can solder steel to copper as well if you're doing this for ornamental purposes. So now, a little special request here from a friend of mine. Now, I know there are people out there that do jewelry and like to make a permanent link on a chain or something. So obviously your needle nose or whatever your appliances that you're using to make your jewelry. Now we're going to use, I'm just using the grounding strip out of a piece of 14-2 electrical wire, just for the purposes of showing people how to join two joints together. Now if you want to get really crazy with this, some jewelry makers do this by brazing, which is a different gamut altogether. Much higher temperatures. You're going to need much, higher, basically different gear to make that work. So I'm just going to make a little crude ring here, just to show how to permanently join them so that they don't pull apart. Okay. As you can see there, just made sort of fashioned a crude little ring just as an example. Just going to split that apart a little bit here. Now, ultimately, it doesn't matter whether you're doing electronics. This is a little camera board that I made up from just soldering some brass stock from a hobby shop and a CCD. All of this all done by hand, all with just simple soldering techniques. It doesn't really matter whether you're doing electronics, whether you're doing plumbing, whether you're doing art, whether you're doing sheet metal work. The basic principles for solder is really all the same. What changes is the products that you use, whether you're using plumbing solder or electronic solder or lead bricks, what have you. So for this demonstration we're going to use the electrical means of heating up this fitting and making a joint, a solid joint between these two contact points here. Now once again, same rule applies. You want to have all of the varnish that's on it and all of the oxidation. You want all of that cleaned off. You want to clean that as much as possible. We're going to do that while we're waiting for the electrical our Weller unit here to heat up. It looks like it's ready to go. Okay, same thing. A little bit of flux. Just a dab. You don't need a whole terribly bunch. Now you can use the flux core electronic solder for smaller applications, but I still prefer using the bigger stuff. Now you're going to think, well, it's pretty hard to control a large piece of solder and heat and try to get a large quantity of, or a little bit of solder off of a large roll. There's a trick to it. Now everybody solders a little bit differently. What I like to do when I'm soldering is I use this like a pen. So I take the tip of my solder and I melt it onto here. So you just hold it on there. It takes a second for it to heat up, but it will heat up. See it there? Okay, so much like an old-fashioned ink well, you now have a little bit of ink on the tip of your solder gun, your soldering device. And I'm now going to just apply it lightly to these two joints until I see it start to wick into the joint. Because remember, this tip also has to heat up the copper as well as the solder, which isn't going to take too terribly long because it's such a small fitting. And there you go. You have one solid joint out of silver solder. That's all there is to it. Pretty simple. It's always nice to have a little bit of water around you too, if you know, the fitting gets a little hot. There you go. I noticed I missed it a little bit on the other side, but that's all just in the details. If you're doing this on a, trying to make a nice piece of jewelry, make sure you do the back side as well as the front side, because what I did just basically went in between the two pieces of copper and the top. There's nothing on the bottom. Now that's still a pretty solid joint, but you wanted to make it look nice, so take your time with it. And that concludes your lesson on soldering. Thank you.